We're moving on to our next spotlight, and we have Jason Rodriguez, who's going to be in dialogue with Minya Oh on her 5-mic review of Nas's Illmatic. All right.
Thank you so much. What's up, everybody? Hello. Check, check, check.
All right, so we're in business. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jason Rodriguez. I'm sitting here with Minya Oh, a.k.a. Miss Info, a.k.a. Shortie.
Yeah, we have to run through all of the...
We'll get into that. Nom de plumes.
Yep.
But it's an honor for me to be here. I've known Minya for a long time, but we also recently worked together for the first time.
Yep.
On a podcast.
Tell them what it was.
The Bridge, 50 Years of Hip Hop. It was a Spotify original, hosted by Minya and Nas, and so it was very much a full circle moment. And we will run in that circle again one more time.
I know. I mean, there's so much. First of all, thank you, Jay, for holding my hand through this. I have to admit that I kind of wasn't ready for the magnitude and for how I would feel, and which is sometimes surprising for someone who, in this day and age, journalists, we are often on camera or on mic at the same time as we are, behind our typewriters. Old school term. Yeah. But I wanted to just sort of gather myself, because this is actually the first time that I have been back at Columbia since I graduated Columbia way in the Stone Ages.
So let me get into that.
Yeah.
Because I want to acknowledge in the room. So we have a lot of our peers here, but there's a lot of journalism or students here that go to Columbia. So that's a good place for us to start, because you were a student.
Oh, but be clear. Yeah. I was never in the journalism school.
But
so
student. You were a
student. Yeah, I was
here
a student. I was an undergrad.
So take us to your experience being a student here, because there was a lot of unique things that were happening here at your time on campus, most notably Stretch and Bobbito's radio show, which kind of ties into a bit of your career and just your time on campus.
It was the greatest. It was the greatest time to be alive. I know that everybody feels that way, but I came here from Chicago. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, and then I moved to the north side of Chicago. And even while I was in high school, I was constantly writing these letters to the editors at the Source magazine, because that was, as you guys might know, since you're historians of this, as well as people who were in it, that was the Bible of hip hop. And so I would write them, and I would just beg them for an internship, or beg them to just, sweep the floor, do anything at the offices. And I had this idea of it just being like, the White House, but filled with hip hop journalists. And I came to Columbia, and at the time, I got a letter from John Schechter saying, like, okay, well, you can come through because we have noticed your enthusiasm. I had no credentials except for the high school newspaper, and a lot of passion. At the time that I was an intern, and I've joked about this before. I don't think I think I was an unpaid intern for at least 5 years. And I was, during that time, writing, some of the lead reviews for the magazine. I was also in charge of tape recording the Stretch and Bobbito show at 3 o'clock in the morning, because I was on campus. I could hold the antenna of my boombox just so I could actually get the entire broadcast. I would, flip the tape. I stayed up the whole time. Then I would copy the cassette, and I would bring it for all the editors. And that was, it was probably one of my official duties. And so as I was listening to the show every Thursday, this is 89 Tech 9. I'm sure you guys have heard of Stretch and Bobbito, and you know about how legendary that show is and how important it was to hip hop.
From Columbia University.
It was right here on campus. And I remember one time, I can't really tell you whether I was an insider or whether everyone was an insider, right? Like, it just felt so much smaller that I think that if you loved hip hop, you were also in it. It wasn't that there was a separation between the audience and the people who were like making it, because we were all making it together in some way. You basically weren't a fan unless you were somehow contributing, whether you were a small-time promoter and you were, throwing parties at your, in your town or what the case may be. And I remember that there was a lot of buzz about this kid. I think Nas was Nasty Nas, and he was 17 at the time when Live at the Barbecue came out. That was a Main Source song, and he was a guest. But it's so funny thinking back then. I don't know how things got viral, because obviously it was like kind of pre-internet, and it was definitely pre-social media. But it was definitely a viral sensation. There was a groundswell. There was a feeling of excitement. Everybody was talking about this kid from Queensbridge, Nasty Nas. And I remember he showed up to the Stretch and Bobbito show, and he dropped a freestyle. It was him, Big L, and I think Herb McGruff, a Harlem native. And it was just sort of this moment that I don't think that you had to be an expert to feel something change underneath your feet. And I remember all of us going over the show and talking about it, and everybody, there was like a lot of rumors, and people were starting to call him the second coming of Rakim. And just to put it into perspective, I think at the time in New York City, New York was obviously the birthplace of hip hop, and it was sort of the arbiter of taste. We had the magazine, The Source. We had the artists. We had the culture, and I say we, even though I was coming from Chicago, but I just embraced it. But there were things that were happening in the years right before '94 that I think gave people a little pause. There was, the Chronic. There were even alternative kind of cultures within hip hop that were growing, whether it was Spice One, Compton's Most Wanted. Like, it wasn't just all the same gangster rap. It wasn't just NWA. It was also Ghetto Boys and Scarface, and my boy Common was coming up from Chicago at the time. So there were suddenly these things that were pulling the energy and the electricity and the hype away from New York. And I think that there was, in all ways, pressure creates diamonds. And I think that made a lot of people step up. Like, you saw Wu-Tang step in, Tribe Called Quest drop Midnight Marauders. I mean, these are works that, will last throughout history. There's no question.
I wanted to ask you, so you mentioned pressure and build-up. So Nas goes on Stretch and Bobbito, does a memorable freestyle, and then he had a single that was released, I believe it was like 1992. It was on a movie soundtrack. But from that time when that single came, the build-up into his album was quite some time.
Yeah, it was 3 years from Live at the Barbecue until Illmatic. But even before, the Illmatic actually dropped in April of '94, but long before that, we were all hearing leaks. There was lots of discussion. Everybody was, because the people that were working on the album were Premier, Q-Tip, Pete Rock. So those guys were also spreading the word that they were all seeing it. They were witness to what was happening. And so that just created even more hype. And also, by the way, I think I told Nas this while we were doing the pod, but when he was up at Stretch and Bob, I called like a true fan. Like, I just called just to be like, I think your shit is fresh.
Right.
And I think that I also tried to be like extra cool by saying, can I speak to Nasir?
Right.
Like I knew him or something. The other funny thing is that I don't think until many, many years later did he even know, because after my time at The Source and then I was at Vibe and Double XL, and I've definitely made the rounds. I even, crossed over and sold out and worked at Condé Nast for a little while, and then I came back. I came back into the fold, and I went to MTV and then Hot 97. But during all of that time, especially at Hot 97, I would see Nas all the time, and he had no clue.
He didn't connect it.
He did not connect it, and the reason for that was because I wrote under a pen name, Shortie, And I think that it really speaks to the time. You got to think in the early 90s, a little Korean American girl from Chicago, especially from Chicago, the boonies, writing about hip hop and actually critiquing huge albums, really important projects for these labels, I think was very controversial. I think it really speaks to how special The Source was at the time. We had editors James Bernard, Reggie Dennis, Carter Harris, John Schechter, and I think that it was something about hip hop in that era, in that golden era, where it was really you proving how much did you love it and how much did you want it, and can you show me how much you care about this, and it wasn't necessarily like you don't look right or you're not like you don't fit this mold. So it did seem kind of like a band of misfits, in the best way possible, and I stayed low to the ground. I didn't, I stayed out of people's way, and I just tried to grind out. So I remember, I feel like I probably did angle for this review.
Yeah, I was gonna say, how did you get assigned the review? You did
I was
a number
already
of lead
doing,
reviews.
yeah, I was already doing a lot of reviews.
Lead reviews at that, which is something.
Yeah,
different.
but this was probably the biggest, and then I think I probably asked for it. But I was still super shocked. I mean, so shocked when John Schechter handed me this cassette tape. It was straight from Columbia Records, along with the track listing. And, I've been talking about this review for 30 years with this much trepidation. But I do remember that the offices were down on Lower Broadway in Soho. I had a bright yellow waterproof Sony Walkman. I don't know if any of y'all remember those.
Iconic right there.
And it locked. It had a little suction that would lock when you so they would be waterproof. And I went down in the train on Broadway in Lafayette, caught the D train to go uptown back to Columbia. At that point, we had the 1-9. There is no longer a 9 train, but I was catching the 1-9. And I remember that I started the tape. I put my headphones on, the ones with the foam that would get all ratty. And I stood there at the on the train platform, and probably 6 or 7 trains went by. I never got on that train because I just sat there listening to that album. And I don't remember time, space, place. There was just something so different about that album. I mean, do y'all agree? Illmatic, instant classic. I mean, that album changed my life in many, many ways. There was something so submersive about it that I think that wherever you were coming from, you were suddenly deep into the psyche of someone living in Queensbridge, in a way that wasn't appropriation, in a way that wasn't voyeurism. It was like you felt all of the struggle, the pain, the glory, the triumph that Nas was communicating. You somehow related it to yourself and the things that you might have been going through in any place that you were. So it was really special. And I also want to point out that there was no need for me to even vocalize or clarify how special it was the next morning. It wasn't like I needed to get off my hot take. I didn't have to have an opinion right away. I was able to sit with it. That was the luxury, the ultimate luxury of that time. Magazines took about almost 3 months. So I don't know exactly, but I probably had weeks to write this short review. I cringe reading it now. Like I literally, I can't even look at it. But I do think that I was given the space to really sit with it. And, even 30 years later, it'll be 30 years this April, I feel like it holds true. both the reaction of everybody. The other thing is that what's so glorious is that I never knew how anybody else reacted to either my review or to the album except for my friend group. I didn't have to read a bunch of rebuttals. I didn't have to see whether anybody agreed with me according to how many times they retweeted it or liked it. So I think that builds a different mentality, and you have a different confidence in your own mind if you are allowed to make a decision and you have to stand by that decision for 30 years.
Yeah. And then we have to wrap it up, but I just wanted to ask one last thing in closing. Another reason why this is so notable, and we'll get into it in a later discussion later this afternoon, so it's a preview, but the rating system was unique to hip-hop.
Yes.
and the mic element of it. And so how can you walk us through just quickly, if you can, the decision and how it got 5 mics?
Okay, well, I have definitely...
After it was deemed classic.
I handed in my review, and I was asked how many mics do I think that it deserves. And I felt crazy at the time by saying that it should get 5 mics because that was a unicorn. That never ever happened. And it was on purpose because you want that to be the unattainable goal of every artist. But I just felt like if anything deserves that 5 mics, this does. And thankfully, the editors also agreed. I think everybody thought it at the time. So it's not that I get some credit because I fought the mob and I prevailed and I got this 5 mic rating because I think that it needed it anyways. It would have happened. It was meant to be. But yeah, so that really solidified. That was on every press release from his record company, and that has followed him to this day. That he was a very rare 5 mic review for a debut album, and yeah, like sometimes the world gets it right.
Well, thank you very much, Minya. I'm glad you wrote it, and I'm glad you're here with us today.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much.